Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu got re-elected the fifth time on April 9th polls, and this makes him the longest-serving leader in Israel's history. But after being in office for about a decade, it seems that Netanyahu is facing his toughest challenge yet. Not only is he facing a slew of corruption charges and an attorney general who wishes to see him behind bars, but also a fast-failing struggle to form a government before the May 29th deadline. His biggest roadblock is the right-wing, ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties demanding the waiver of compulsory military conscription for their seminary students. Today, we will be discussing with our guests what lies ahead for Netanyahu's Likud party. And let me introduce our guests here. We have with us Mr. Seth Frantzman, an analyst who's joining us from Jerusalem. We also have with us Mr. Bilal Salaymeh, research fellow at CETA Foundation in Ankara, and Dr. Wajjeh Abuzarefah, the professor of political science specialized in Israeli studies in Gaza. Thank you for joining us, all three of you, on Newswire. Let me start with you, Seth. Could we say that, is it looking bad for Netanyahu? Are his days numbered?
Well, I think that Netanyahu won the last election, but he has a lot of trouble trying to create a coalition because all the different little parties that he would want to, he needs to include them in his coalition to get to the 60 seats that he needs. All of them, I think, are trying to blackmail him and try to force him to kind of trade, something for each party. So, for instance, one of the parties wants to make sure that the ultra-Orthodox Jews are going to the army. One of the parties doesn't want that because they're Orthodox. And also, Netanyahu has his own issues. He wants to make sure that he gets some sort of perhaps immunity bill from prosecution because he's under a cloud of corruption. So I think it's very difficult for him. And he's going to bring it right down to the wire to try to force these parties to come to the table.
Right. So, Dr. Wajjeh, Netanyahu seeking to get this immunity, is he limiting the Supreme Court's power in case of the corruption cases that are against him?
Yes, Netanyahu in difficult situation, interior difficult situation right now because of the investigation, because of the corruption issues, but in the same time, there are no other choices in Israel.
Right.
All the Israeli community is going right and being more fundamentalism, more radicalism. So it is a lot of choices in front of the Israeli citizens there to choose out of Netanyahu. They have another choice is with the left, if we can say it's left in Israel. So there are no other choices. Netanyahu is strong enough to continue, right? Maybe the government will be not with a lot of seats in the Knesset, but in the same time, all of the parties who participate to the coalition are agree to the policy of the coalition. So it's not a lot of difference between the parties. Of course, there are another issue, the issue of the Judaism and the Jewish community, which needs more things from Netanyahu. But in the same time, I think the coalition, it will be strong enough to continue with or without Lieberman and the other parties.
Right. So, Mr. Bilal, let me get your opinion on this. Do you feel like Mr. Netanyahu is being put in a tough position right now while every party is looking to get its best advantage, is holding him hostage at this point?
Exactly. Mr. Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu is in a difficult situation, not after the election. Actually, he is in difficult situation from the last year with the collapse of his government and the allegation of corruption that he faced in Israel. And after that, the collapse of his government after the withdrawal of that time Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman, who is now trying to utilize as much as he can and take benefit from the situation, giving the point that Netanyahu, although he took almost 32 seats in the Knesset, but he is not able to form the coalition government again without Lieberman, since he need to have plus 60 seats in the Knesset. So Netanyahu apparently now he is in difficult situation. Lieberman knows that very well, so he's trying to take advantage as much as he can. And there is a problem actually beyond Netanyahu within the Israeli politics in general, the fragmentation of political landscape in Israel, which we have facing or seeing in the last years actually. Means that it is not easy to any prime minister, either Netanyahu or another one who would be the leading party, to form a government in such a fragmented political landscape.
Right. So, Mr. Seth, what is your take? Do you agree with Mr. Bilal that there is a fragmented political landscape there in Israel? And if so, do these corruption charges have something to do with that, for hanging on for so long and not resolving?
Well, there is a fragmented political landscape in Israel in the sense that you have parties all the way from the more far left, and then also Arab nationalist parties and a communist party, and then you have several centrist parties, and then you have religious parties, and you have right-wing parties and extreme right-wing parties and settler parties. So, yeah, I mean, Israeli politics is a huge mess, but there is basically a large consensus of the voters who are basically center-right, who are basically center-right, slightly nationalists. Many of them are slightly, Jewish, a bit Jewish and traditional. So, Netanyahu kind of galvanizes that support. And actually, when you see the last election, the fact that so many Israelis voted for Netanyahu or Gantz, who's basically a centrist, shows that most Israelis are in the center. But the problem with the election system is all the little parties have a huge amount of influence to build this coalition.
Right. And this is where the state is, because the right-wing, ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties want a sort of waiver so that their seminary students don't have to enlist in the army, which is compulsory in Israel.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, Netanyahu could just not include all those parties in his coalition. The problem is he doesn't have a good way to include left-wing parties in his coalition either, because the center-left, for instance, would be objected to by his right-wing partners. So that's the real problem. Netanyahu, by the way, could just create a giant coalition with the centrist party under Gantz. But I think that Netanyahu doesn't want to have anyone else who is as much of a leader as he is, because he wants to be the central man. So he wants to play all these people off against each other. And that's how he's dominated Israeli politics for the last 10 years, is he always makes sure that he's head and shoulders above any other contender.
Right. But then when a Likud parliament, Miki Zohar, he floats this dissolution paper, says he's going to submit it in the parliament, is this part of Netanyahu's bluff?
Well, look, I think that Netanyahu wants to threaten to force these parties to go back to elections because, I think this is a kind of high-stakes game of chicken where he's trying to say, okay, fine, if you don't come and, agree to this coalition agreement, then I'm going to force you to go to elections again. And you might, by the way, be out of parliament next time. So I think it's a very high-stakes game he's playing. He has, 48 hours now or less to bring this agreement. So it's a dangerous kind of brinksmanship that he's involved in.
Mr. Bilal, do you think Netanyahu is going to meet this May 29 deadline?
I'm not sure of that, actually. Now, it is, and he's calling for a re-election again, maybe just a kind of negotiation methods. He tried hard to negotiate with Lieberman. Lieberman knows that very well, and he said that he will give approval for his bill to go to a new re-election in Israel. He is in a tough situation, but I do agree with the guest who has already mentioned that there is no another alternative in Israel now, and Netanyahu is knowing that very well, and he is trying very hard in last years and in this election also not to have another candidate to be leading the Israeli politics. So if he will not able to form this coalition with these fragmented far rights and rights parties, he will prefer to go to a new election and re-election instead of form the coalition with the centrist parties.
But the real question is, the question then is, Dr. Wajjeh, and if you could please share your insight on this, who would be the biggest winner and who would be the biggest loser if new elections are called in because a coalition government can't be formed?
I think that today it will be a meeting between Netanyahu and the head of the right parties. I think maybe it will difficult. It will be a very difficult negotiation between Netanyahu and them. But I think he will succeed to make his coalition today or tomorrow at least. And I don't think that the Israeli right parties, they are ready to go to the election, especially Lieberman, because the last time Lieberman, it could be not, it could not to be in the Knesset. So I think they will agree. Netanyahu know how to negotiate them. Netanyahu know how to make coalition and how to make agreements between him and the right parties. So I think maybe in the next 24 hours we will find a new government in Israel with a new coalition, which no change in the policy of the coalition which have been decided. Right
so you're
now.
hopeful there will be they'll manage to form a new government. Thank you so much, Dr. there for your insight into this matter. We're also going to investigate a little on the protests that have taken place since September 2017 on against sort of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and especially now in him trying to seek immunity from these corruption cases. So, Mr. Bilal, what's your take on this? Do you think that the sort of numbers growing on these protests that take place once a week, is this unprecedented against a leader of the Israeli government?
The dynamics of these protesters, which is taking place now in Israel, in Tel Aviv mainly, is not only about the last allegation against Netanyahu and his attempts to have immunity against the prosecution, but it's also about the dynamics of intense politics within Israel. For example, we see that the opposition parties, and mainly, for example, Benny Gantz, who was the head of the centrist coalition against Netanyahu, and who was the candidate to be instead of Netanyahu as a prime minister, who yesterday he was addressing the protesters in Tel Aviv, and he was accusing Netanyahu of being the one-man show and giving, how to say, and not serving the Israeli national interest. So it is clear that the opposition also is using this protest against Netanyahu for its mobilization of the political landscape in general. So there are many dynamics in this, behind this protest, not only about against Netanyahu and his allegation, also opposition is trying to utilize this protest for its mobilization.
Okay, let's also ask a senior journalist, investigative journalist from Israel, Mr. Yossi Melman, who's just joining us about this matter. Also, welcome to Newswire, Mr. Yossi. We're talking about the protests that are taking place. The one that took place on Saturday was supposedly the biggest yet against Netanyahu. What do you make of it? Do you think the timing of these protests is significant at all?
Well, it takes time. It's a very slow process. The Attorney General has been criticized for being very soft on the process itself. He has extended time and again the time for Netanyahu's hearing. It's quite clear that Netanyahu is stalling time, playing games by hiring and firing his lawyers, but eventually it would be resolved, and it would end with a result one way or another, most probably with charges and indictment within a few months.
Also, Mr. Yossi, analysts say that Israeli law is strict, irrespective of who the person is in question on trial, whether there have been incidents in the past where senior leaders have been prosecuted and put behind bars for corruption charges, fraud charges, senior ministers also. Do you think the cases against Netanyahu hold veracity, credibility, or is there some kind of political victimization that is taking place?
No, the process is quite clear. The law is clear. In the past 2 decades, members of parliament were charged, indicted, and sent to jail for corruption. A president was sent to jail for sexual abuses and even rape. A prime minister, Ehud Olmert, had to resign to step down and was sent to jail. He just finished his term a few 2-3 years ago. Therefore, the process and the law is clear. However, members of parliament have immunity, and it's up to the parliament to strip them of their immunity. As far as the prime minister is concerned, he can theoretically be in office while the legal procedures are taking action against him, including the possibility, which sounds very, very odd, that he would be a prime minister while defending himself in court.
That's interesting, because the problem is that the case hasn't even started yet. There has been, like you mentioned, a continuous stall in the process of taking this case forward. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's not really that the case is not in place. Practically, the Attorney General, following the police investigation, decided to bring charges and to indict Netanyahu. However, although it's not something within the law, it has been a practice, a common practice for many, many years, that dignitaries or politicians are entitled for a pre-trial hearing or indicted hearing before the Attorney General, in order to convince him as a last resort that he should drop the indictment against them. And therefore, we are waiting for the hearing, and Netanyahu indeed is stalling time because he doesn't want to be indicted. But my understanding is that at least on one case, he has 3-4 cases of corruption, at least one, which is the most serious case, he would be indicted.
He would be indicted. Okay, so there are tens of thousands of people out there protesting on Saturday, and allegedly this is the largest group to have gotten together in harmony in protesting Netanyahu's corruption cases. And Benny Gantz is leading this group and giving speeches. Do you think he has a shot here if there's a re-election?
Well, the demonstration organized by the opposition parties is aimed not against the charges as they are at the moment. They are aimed at the future legislation. Netanyahu and his coalition partners and his party would like, once they are in session, and it's not clear, we might know today or tomorrow whether we're going to a new elections, because he has difficulties to form a new coalition. However, if he forms a new coalition, he aims to pass 3 important laws which basically would undermine the judiciary and especially the powers of the Supreme Court. Secondly, it would give him a full immunity. He benefits already from an immunity, parliamentary immunity, but he wants to extend this immunity so he won't be even investigated or indicted or charged while he's in office. And that was the purpose of the demonstration. It's not about what's going on now. It's about the future, the near future.
So again, let me ask you about Benny Gantz here. Do you think he is in a position right now, the way things are going, that he might be able to get some backing of the Likud's allies and persuade President Rivlin to put together a majority in parliament? Because if Netanyahu doesn't, there is a chance that another legislator will be called by the president to do so.
Oh, yes, he does have a full support of his party, his party and its voters. And it even came to the point where cabinet ministers were termed by the media as puppets on a string, because they basically are like, they refuse to criticize Netanyahu. They keep their mouth and they are shout and they are silent. They fear for their political future. They don't dare even saying one word against Netanyahu. So he benefits from a full, he enjoys full support of the party, his coalition partners, and also the public at large. Although in the last elections, the Likud won only 25%, 27% of the vote. But all in all, the Israeli right won the elections and has to form a coalition.
So you think Netanyahu has a bigger support than it's coming across right now? But what are the big issues that he's facing in forming a government? I mean, there's 48 hours, practically 2 days left before the deadline's up. What are the major issues that are coming in his way?
Well, the issues are more personal, power games. It's about ego between politicians and less about substance, about real issues. If there is one issue which is the stumbling block, it's regarding the general draft. Every Israeli at the age of 18 has to go to the military to serve up to 3 years unless he has medical problems. However, the Orthodox community at large has been exempted from sending its sons to the military and sharing the burden that every Israeli does share. And that's the issue. There is a party, secular right-wing party, which is against the religious Orthodox parties, and they are calling to extend and to change the draft law so every Israeli or most Israelis would serve in the military. And that's
so where does, and very quickly, this is the last question, I'm running out of time. If you could shed some light on where does Avigdor Lieberman stand on this also? Is he being a stumbling block also, or is actually going to be helpful in sorting out this problem with the far-right, ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties?
Well, I don't know where it's heading. We will know it within 40 hours. I would guess that it would be very, very bizarre if we have new elections. We just had elections 40 days ago. And it would be unprecedented that in our history, a candidate was not able to form a government and he called immediately for a new round within 40 days. It has never happened before, but I still believe that it's not in the interest of the involved parties to have early elections, and therefore, with the gravity of this issue of general draft and serving in the military, still I think they'll solve it somehow.
All right. Tens of thousands of people out there protesting right now against Prime Minister Netanyahu on not just the corruption charges, but also the heat is turning up in terms of it not forming a coalition government. But with that, we unfortunately can't pursue this any further. We've run out of time here. We will take a short break and we will be back with our second story. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire and I'm Ayza Omar. Now, in the first half of the show, we discussed what Israel is going through 40 days after its elections in terms of not just corruption charges that Prime Minister Netanyahu is facing, but also the struggle that he is facing in forming a coalition government. And now we're going to move towards India. A report by an Indian NGO just released some shocking numbers. 233 out of 543 members who have won seats in India's elections have criminal charges against them. And all these are not such small charges. According to the Association of Democracy, an Indian non-partisan organization that works on electoral and political reforms, these charges include some as serious as rape, murder and terrorism. Now, that makes roughly 43% of lawmakers in India's new parliament that are facing these criminal charges. But this can't be called as an unprecedented move. After the last election in 2014, a third or 34% of the 543 MPs elected to parliament were accused of various crimes. So how can we look at this objectively? Could this be political vendettas, or is there actually a problem here where there is a continuous rise of members of parliament coming up with increasing number of cases, criminal cases against them? To find out, we will be speaking to our guests. We have with us Mr. Arun Kumar, who is an analyst and joining us from Delhi. And also we have Mr. Rajesh Sundaram, a journalist joining us also from Delhi. Welcome to Newswire. Now, let me start with you, Mr. Arun. I'm sure you're familiar with this report. The numbers seem to be increasing with each election. In 2014, the percentage was around 34%. Now it is around 43%. What, in your view, is happening here? Do you see this as a very sort of objective, impartial report, or do you think there's some political vendetta also involved?
No, you see, the report of the Association for Democratic Reform is a very impartial report. It's based on the actual data submitted by the candidates, So the Election Commission requires, people to submit data about their assets, about the cases that they have, etc., against them. So these are objective reports based on actual data supplied by the people who are standing for, the elections. Now the question is, why is it rising? That's the important question. And that is because what has happened is that elections have become a game of a lot of big money coming in and so on and so forth. So in a sense, elections today are fought on the basis of A, money power, and B, how much of muscle power can you muster together, to fight the elections. So in other words, there are a lot of undemocratic tendencies that have crept into the Indian elections because there's a very large black economy, which according to my estimate is 62% of GDP, and that black economy implies illegality. Now, illegality can only survive if the political leadership connives with them.
Right.
So till about 83 or so, the criminals used to support the politicians from outside, but after 83, when an amnesty was given to a lot of smugglers, etc., after that, a lot of people with criminal background have started entering politics, and they're directly fighting elections. So that's why criminalization of politics has increased after 83. So that is the trend that we see today.
Okay, so Mr. Rajesh, let's get a point of view here. This number is increasing. It's not just from 2014. In fact, in 2004, it was at 24%. 2009, it was around 30%. And now 2014 was 34%. So what, in your opinion, is happening here that this number continues to rise?
Well, I think this is an alarming situation. If you look at the ADR report, like Mr. Arun Kumar said, it's a very credible organization. And all of the information that it's given out is based on affidavits that the candidates are supposed to give in, disclosing their educational qualifications, criminal records, and all other details, assets. Now, why is this happening? Well, it's a cause of worry. Has civil society done anything about it? Well, yes, they have. There have been a lot of petitions that have been moved to the Supreme Court. In an order last year, the Supreme Court has asked Parliament to step in and bring in legislation that could put an end to this. But on its own, it said that just because somebody is charge sheeted, the Supreme Court cannot then, under the rules, say that they cannot contest elections. Of course, there are very strong laws when it comes to people who are convicted for crimes. They have been barred for various periods of time from contesting elections. But a vast majority of these are people who are facing charges. Some of them are under trials. And of course, you have to keep in mind that there is a great pendency of cases in India's criminal justice system, in the courts. And court cases can drag on for years before they come to a final settlement.
Right.
So now, clearly, this is something which is a serious issue.
It's a serious issue, but let's also ask somebody who has been part of the court. We have with us Mr. Jagdeep Chhokar, a founder of Association for Democratic Reform here. Mr. Jagdeep, we're discussing right now the alarming trend that we are seeing where Indian candidates, members of parliament, are increasingly with each election, the numbers are increasing where they have criminal charges against them. What is in your view, the reason behind this number increasing?
Pretty much what Arun said in the beginning of the program. The fighting or contesting in elections has continued to become more and more expensive. Contest elections, and a fair proportion of this money does not come from legitimate sources. And this kind of money is often provided by people who kind of function in the shadows, and occasionally they get criminal cases against them. So once the people who had these kind of strong armed tendencies and unaccounted money availability, for several years they used to help regular politicians win their elections. But over time, these people thought that instead of helping people to win elections, why don't we contest elections ourselves and win them?
Right.
So that tendency has continued, and political parties have found an easy way to get more and more MPs or members of the Legislative Assembly elected through this means. And there is a new definition of what is a good candidate. Candidates are chosen on the basis of what is called winnability. And winnability often consists of the ability to raise and spend a lot of money, the ability to put together groups of strong armed people who can ensure voting in favor of the candidates. And therefore, political parties have fallen into this trap.
Right. But it's a big concern. It's a big concern whether it's also a sign of moral decay in Indian society. Could it also be a legislation problem? Mr. Arun, do you think, is it true, in fact, there's no law in India that makes political parties drop tainted candidates?
It's not a question of law being there or not there. It's actually a democratic process in which, as Jagdeep was saying, political parties are looking at winnability issue, It's a question of, which are the candidates who can win. And therefore, muscle power and money power have become very important in large parts of the country. And, this black economy is all about illegality. So therefore, as illegality has grown with the black economy, then they want to capture power so that they can continue their power, So it is the people with illegal, activities, etc., who are trying to remain in power so that they can continue their activities, and that's why it's happening. Now, there have been attempts to try and say that, which kind of candidates can stand, etc. There have been some reforms, but the political parties are one step ahead, and therefore they are able to, circumvent many of these things. And that's where I find that in spite of attempts, and the public has made, strong this thing, NGOs like Association for Democratic Reforms has been trying to see that some reform takes place. But, the political parties themselves are not very willing to actually implement those reforms. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that the undemocratic content of our democracy is going up. And that is why, it's not easy to, either pass legislation or to try and control it. So unless the public becomes very active and the public demands accountability, until then, I think this problem is not going to be resolved simply by passing more laws, etc.
So, Mr. Rajesh, do you think that until the public takes a stand, there will not be a proper addressing of the issue? Because my question in that case is that isn't the public at times, though, doesn't want to vote for the criminal, is sort of forced to vote for the criminal because of religious beliefs or caste associations?
Well, all of that really, because, you have a system where all these details are given out in an affidavit. And also, there is a system where most of it is published and it goes out on the papers and televisions. So while a vast majority of the country or a vast number of people in the country are illiterate and don't have access to the media, and they may miss this kind of information, but that's no excuse. They already have access to this information, and some of them, actually a large number of them would have access to the information, know about the criminal educational backgrounds, and may still choose to vote for those candidates based on their preference for caste or religion and things like that. So clearly, I think on the one hand, it is voter education is something that has to play a big role in this. But I must also say that this is not a phenomenon which is limited to India. Countries from as diverse as Philippines, America, all of them have seen criminals being elected. In the current Senate in New York, for instance, there are 30 former and current senators who have criminal backgrounds. Mr. Trump, when he got into the electoral race, he had accused Hillary Clinton of a lot of criminal offenses and said that he's going to prosecute her when she comes to power. But she got more votes than him, although in the electoral college system, he finally won. Also, he himself was accused of a lot of things, including sexual misdemeanors, but he won the elections as well. So clearly, this is a global phenomenon. It has to be understood region by region. Here, of course, we have enough provisions for the voters to be educated, for them to know about the candidates. But in many cases,
that's a really good point there. That's a really good point there that you put out, that while it's not limited to India, it is across the board, whether we're looking at first world countries or third world countries. This is a problem where you see in many cases senior leaderships with a very big tainted charge sheet. So my question really is, Mr. Jagdeep, that then is it because politics provides a shield to those who have convictions of criminal charges? Is it become a sort of place to go to protect yourself, especially if you are a felon or you are a convict?
Well, the law provides that if you are convicted of a criminal offense with imprisonment of 2 years or more, you cannot contest elections. So if one is convicted, then one cannot contest elections. But what happens is that the judicial system is a little slow, and it takes a long time for a final conviction to happen. That is why, that is the loophole that these people take advantage of in, contesting elections and then acquiring power.
Such as in the case of Pragya Thakur, she has been charged of being involved in these blasts, these bomb attacks in a mosque, around a mosque that killed 6 people. It was her motorcycle that was carrying those explosives. But because the trial hasn't started, she's not been convicted. There she is, having won that seat, essentially.
Well, the case is actually still pending, and that is the advantage people are taking off, that there has been no final conviction. And as I said, the judiciary is slow. It is easy to delay finalization of a case, and once a case is finalized, then you go in for appeal. So it becomes a very long process, which is what is
people are taking advantage of. Exactly. But Mr. Arun, also while people are taking advantage of this loophole, because last September, the Supreme Court of India did say that political parties need to adopt a law that would block the entry of people who are facing such heinous charges as manslaughter and terrorism. But of course, the delay is giving them an advantage. But at the same time, doesn't it work in the favor of the political parties to have those with criminal charges, as Mr. Jagdeep pointed out, usually come with a lot of funding? They fund themselves when they start running for these campaigns, for these positions, and hence save the party a lot of money.
So, the reason why, in spite of courts and in spite of the NGO groups, etc., trying to see that criminals don't come into the political arena, you have politicians, with criminal background coming in, because sense our and winnability has become very important for parties. So they're choosing people who can provide muscle power for the elections, who can polarize the population. Because one of the things that's happened is that parties are now divided around caste lines, religious lines, etc. So if you can polarize them along these lines, then they have a better chance of winning. So parties are choosing candidates in different constituencies based on the caste combination, the religion combination, and so on and so forth. And there, you need people who can actually provide that kind of muscle power, who would be able to mobilize these people. So in several states, this kind of thing has happened. Second is because a lot of money is required to fight elections, because they become more and more undemocratic. So that money collection is very important. And that's again where people who have got illegal businesses who can provide that kind of illegal money, because your expenditure limit is up to 70 lakhs. So roughly say about $100,000, but people are spending 10 to 15 times more than that, and all that has to be illegal money. Right. So illegality comes in because you require that kind of money, which only those who have the illegal money, they can provide. So legitimate money is not able to get in, and that's why, the whole politics is getting criminalized, and that's why these people are coming into elections and so on. in spite of the Supreme Court, in spite of the courts, in spite of the NGOs, etc.
But there's also a factor of the Robin Hood complex, in a way, if I can term it this way, that while these are those who have been charged with sort of criminal activities, they have a lot of muscle power, and so could be serving the community better by providing better security. Mr. Rajesh, do you think that's a reasonable factor to play in on why so many criminals continue to run time and again for elections?
Well, that's something which is worrying, but also something which is very difficult not to believe. Mm-hmm. If you look at the case of the so-called Sadhvi Pragya, it's a clear case, where she's accused of a very serious crime, and even the Prime Minister had said, for the statements she made while polarizing the electorate before the election, that he would not forgive her. So these are elements that are highly undesirable. If you look at the kind of outrage that her comments and her and the BJP giving her a ticket has caused within civil society, one will understand that this is not something that is acceptable to the right-thinking people in India. While they are in a majority or minority, people wouldn't know. Many of them would even be ignorant, especially the millennials, to the history of India or the role that was played by Mahatma Gandhi and the other founding fathers. But you're right, there is a bit of a Robin Hood phenomenon in this, and there are many of these musclemen who have tremendous clout within the community, within the caste system that they have. And that is what the political parties want to milk. The muscle power and money power that they bring with them is something that the political parties want to milk. But that's also something that's very short-sighted. That's something that will weaken the democratic process, not just in India, but any other country where such tendencies can be seen. And this is something which will require true political will to bring in a legislation and stop entirely. Mm-hmm. Whether that political will exists, well, that's something we'll have to wait and see, because there's a new parliament in place. Right. But if you ask many people, they would say that the political parties across the board are quite happy with the situation, and they would perhaps be not a situation where there is a legislation that's brought that stops this.
Right. So, Ms. Arun, come to you. You got the gist of my question there. Whether or not these facts and figures really play into the larger picture here is leading a nation. There were 900 million voters who voted, and obviously they knew who they were voting for, these implications, these charges. What do you think is the way forward here? Do you think there's a better way of doing it, putting better candidates, or it doesn't really matter?
So, let me step back a little. The fact that there's a Robin Hood image, why does that come? Because the people on the ground are not getting the gains of development. Development is very skewed, and there's large amount of inequality, and the aspirations at the lower level are rising. So people think that if my man comes to power, then he would be able to give to me. And that's why India's politics has got fractured along religious lines, caste lines, etc. Because if my man is there, if he's corrupt or criminal, he'll deliver to me. So even though overall, when you have these criminals coming in, development slows down and the gains of development are frittered away through corruption, but the people believe that that's the only way to get it. So as long as people believe that that's the only way to get gains, they will support criminal elements coming into politics, etc. And that is where I think the problem lies. So unless our development process becomes more equitable and gains begin to flow down, in a more equitable manner, and people get a sense of social justice, at the moment people think that there's injustice and that they are being oppressed while others are gaining. As long as this sense of social injustice is there, right, the political process will become more and more undemocratic. So It's the public consciousness that has to rise, that only when the democracy really thrives, that the gains will come. So accountability of politics is very important, accountability of business is very important, and only when that happens, then will the democratic situation reverse from where we are headed, in a very undemocratic structure. So I believe, the need for a lot of reform of our politics, of our businesses, etc., and then only will the situation of elections also change.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Arun and Mr. Rajesh and Mr. Jagdeep, for your wonderful insight into this matter. There were 233 out of 543 members who got voted in the world's largest elections that come with criminal charges. And that was the discussion for today. That's all the time we have. We will see you tomorrow. Thank you for watching Newswire. Goodbye.